Hello, everyone. Let's get this session kicked off. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tracy Zatinig, the Marketing Manager at Amplifi. Today, we'll be discussing migration best practices with EnterWorks. As you know, when registering for this webinar, you had the option to pre-submit questions related to our migration topic. Answers to those questions will be within our talking points today. Some of the questions submitted did apply to another topic, but we do have those specific topics covered in a webinar that we have scheduled later this year. So stay tuned for all of our Ask the Expert webinars for 2021. As with all sessions conducted by Amplifi, a recording will be made available to all registrants via email in the coming days and will be always hosted on our website under resources for your review. Take note at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button where you can submit questions to our panel. However, due to our limited time and the complexity of our discussion, we will most likely have to hold questions until the end, or we will follow up directly via email following. Without further ado, let's get to know our experts. Joining us today, we have three of our most knowledgeable teammates here at Amplifi when it comes to our EnterWorks platform. Michael Anwali, who is our EnterWorks practice lead, Eric Gilbo, a principal architect, and solution consultant, Jeff Bielke. David Howard is also joining us. He's a solutions engineer at Winshuttle. At this time, I'll hand everything over to Eric to explain a bit about our topic today.
Thank you, Tracy. So one of the things we want to kind of focus in on today is the concept of how to handle after the initial implementation, making changes to the environment and pushing those environmental changes across the different areas of the system, like from your dev environment all the way up to production. It's a fairly easy process when we start an initial implementation project because those environments don't necessarily exist yet. So it's really easy for us to just simply copy the data from one environment to the other. But then as we kind of move through and you start building new functionality, the question becomes, I don't want to overwrite functionality in a lower environment, or I don't want to overwrite the environmental information as we move it up the stack and cause potential issues with my upstream systems in the upper levels. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. And we start with that concept of what we do with an initial implementation, which is copying the entire database. It's a fairly simple process, right? What we do is we take all of the configuration, we take all of the components all at one time, we copy those over and move it up the technology stack, which works really well when there's not a lot of users in the system making changes in production on a daily basis. So from time to time, we're still going to want to refresh that information. So we do want to push that back to the lower environments, but you don't necessarily want to do that on a regular basis either, because you might overwrite some of the changes that somebody might be working on in the development environment that hasn't been pushed up to the production environment. So what you really want to do is kind of build a strategy around that first and understand how you want to do that at a high level. And then from there, we can start using some of the tools like the migration tool that's built within the EnterWorks tool to do that. And then look at some of the elements that don't necessarily get migrated automatically using that migration tool and figuring out a kind of a plan around that. So David, I'll kind of open this up to you a little bit as we talk about the migration process. When we look at the concept of copying the entire database and copying essentially the entire configuration, how often do you recommend moving all that information kind of back down the technology stack, down to QA and down to dev so that your environments are in line?
Generally speaking, when we want to move things back down the technology stack, it really has to be a planned and scheduled activity. The reason for that is, as you mentioned before, you don't want to overwrite any data that might be impacting QA activities that are going on in your lower environment. However, you may want to refresh the data components with actual data that's going on in your production environment so that you can be sure that your changes that are going on in the lower environment will actually make sense, or to see how it might impact the data that's already in that environment. Depending on your governance rules and your governance plans inside of your organization, this is something that you may be able to take on half a year basis, a quarterly basis. It really all depends on your comfort with making changes to the EnterWorks environment once it has gone live in production, and the scale and the speed with which you think you'll be making changes to that environment as you become more comfortable with it and you start to expand and explore different ways that you can use the EnterWorks platform. But I think the key to it all still is making sure that you have a really good governance plan on how to move any data, how to move any rules, how to move the current data model, which should pretty well be in sync if you're moving things from the lower environment all the way up to prod already. But just to make sure that you have a good governance plan on how to make sure that you don't impact the lower environment as you move that data down.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways you can kind of do that is actually take advantage of the migration tool within the system, right? And if we think about, let's say I'm working on a development component in my dev environment, we know that we're going to schedule a down grade of all the data from prod back to QA and copy that back to dev. We could use the migration tool to pull out any functions that I might be working on in dev and QA, put a halt to that, right? And say, okay, we're going to stop any development work for the next 48-hour window, 72-hour window, whatever it takes to do that, and then re-migrate that information back into those lower environments, right, that you were working on.
Correct. Correct. The migration tool is very useful to be able to do that in a way that you don't have to rely on, kind of doing what I would call the side-by-side screen activities between your environments to ensure that all the configurations are set the way that you need to. Obviously, there will be some configuration components that you don't want to bring down, server names, things like that, etc. But the majority of the artifacts that you may need to work with, or the majority of the data, physical data that you may want to work with, the migration tool is a really helpful and useful activity within the platform to allow that to happen.
Perfect. And Jeff, I know you've worked quite a bit with the whole process, right, of migrating the data up the technology stack. So somebody's working on a component in the dev environment, they get it approved through the developers and it's prepared. You're getting ready to move it to QA. And there's a lot of kind of things you need to do beforehand and things to think of before you actually even use the migration tool. Can you kind of explain your process and how you do that today?
Yeah, really. So what I've done is over the years, we've compartmentalized it into several different iterations. The very first thing would be always running the comparison script so you can compare the environments back and forth. That allows you to drop them into WinMerge so that you can flag all those variations. And that really gives you kind of a keystone to work through change management meetings so that everybody can be aware of all the moves that need to be made, any manual changes that need to be made, and things like the scheduled activities, those kind of jobs, they need to be manually moved up as well. But going through the painstaking iterations really does help keep everything smooth and make it so you don't have to continually change what you've done or rerun your migrations. So it's really just being meticulously organized in the preparation. So from comparisons from running the comparisons to actually comparing the items and documenting everything for any sort of change management.
And those comparison scripts and the process for doing that's actually in the EnterWorks documentation too, right? In the migration best practices doc, I believe that information is available, right?
It is, yeah. There's a large section on it, and there's a lot. And really, when you're running through that section, you want to make sure to hit every T, every I, so that everything runs smoothly. Because if you run them with different column widths, anything like that, you can get a lot of variance, and then basically when you run them through WinMerge, it's completely red, and you have to start all over. So it is a whole section.
So what are some of the things you kind of look for when you're getting ready to migrate that information? What are some of the key data elements that you take a look at first if you're to kind of prioritize?
Prioritize, I want to look at name values first. If we're trying to move over sort of a profile and say someone has changed a name to add an S or added an apostrophe or something to it, the migration tool is not going to overwrite that. It's going to add in a brand new attribute for that. So that's what I'm looking for, is slight variances on those. If it's brand new, then I'm going to allow it to migrate. But what I really want to dial in on is any changes that need to be made manually, because that's just going to create continual headaches down the line every time you try to create a migration. Also data types and also code sets, because code sets don't overwrite either. So you want to pay really careful attention to the code sets.
Okay, so kind of after you've done the comparison process, is there a meeting with between the groups to kind of discuss what you found? How do you usually approach any discrepancies you see?
I would always want to implement some sort of a change management ritual. So every time, if you have a schedule for the migration every 2 weeks, you'd want to run that change management probably about 2 days previous. So any manual changes need to be made. You have a full day to get in there and get them utilized. But it's always good to have that full change management process. That way, everybody is aware of all the changes that can be made. If there's a component that's tied to a specific attribute that you're not aware of that will break, say, a workflow or something like that, that is not ready to be made, that's when that flag can be raised, and you can make sure not to move that until the next change or the next migration.
So you mentioned, you kind of brought up workflows, which is interesting too, because that's independent, right? That's kind of a separate component within EPX, but sometimes those attributes are tied to a workflow component. How do you usually look through that, and what's the approach on that?
Just verifying any restricted names that are going to be utilized with whoever is on the workflow team. You want to work really specifically with them to make sure that if an attribute changes, say its data size, its data type, or where it lives, as far as repositories go, you can completely blow up hours and hours of work. So it's really, you'll have the change management meeting, but if you do have something that's going to affect someone's workflow, you definitely want to have sort of a side meeting with them to make sure that all your changes are in line with what they're expecting to be there.
Yeah. And along that line too, David, I think, is there an approach that Winshuttle recommends for that whole data governance process? Do you have something in mind that you suggest typically for a new client?
Generally for new clients, when we're doing an implementation and working either with our services or with partners such as yourself, we really encourage the customers to get involved in the implementation as early as possible. There's training available. There's the ability to start to utilize the system as you're building out the data models, as you're starting to build out the rules, as you're starting to build out any of the workflows, so that not only will the customer be more engaged within the implementation, but they'll also have an understanding of how the various components are interlinked together, so that they can start to take that knowledge as the product and the project has been implemented and make those changes themselves, and they're aware internally as far as what the governance needs to be. But we really find that there are some customers that are really ready and have really good data governance in place. And then there are other customers where we have to really kind of take a hand-holding approach and work with them as we're going through the implementation, or as our partners are going through the implementation, to help them develop those good governance practices. But it is very important to understand the data model, the sources of the data, and how often they're going to be coming into the system. Any types of data processing that you need to do that is workflow related, the workflow is very powerful, but we don't recommend trying to do every workflow that you can think of right off the bat, because you will overwhelm people with the tasks and the amount of activities that are going on. But the nice benefit of the EnterWorks platform, since it is configurable, since there is a lot of flexibility there, is that customers, as they're starting to do the implementation, can start to build around the things that are most important first, the biggest bang for the buck as they're going through that implementation. And you can easily scale up to other data types, other data attributes, other workflows, etc., without having to go through a rigorous training activity or having to go through a brand new implementation. It lends itself very well. But first things first, make sure that you have a really good understanding of your data, the model that the data is going to be facilitating, and the workflow that you need to run for certain tasks in your environment, and put really strong governance organizations around that internally.
Okay, great. And then, so let's kind of take that to the next step, right? We've gone through and we've done the comparison, like Jeff said, between the two environments. We've got our data governance plan in place. We've kind of reviewed, everyone understands what we're doing. How does the migration tool in the UI play into that? Can I set up individual attributes and send just a single attribute? Do I send everything in the configuration? Like how do you build that out, Jeff?
You can. So when you go through the migrate out feature, you can go down to individual attributes or entire profiles, repositories, specific code sets, things like that. That really ties back into the change management meetings, because if you only have 3 or 4 attributes that need to be moved, or say the data type is changing, you do not have to completely override an entire profile. You can focus in on just those specific components. So there is the section where you can when you're going into the migrate out, you can compartmentalize everything you need out of it. That's really ties into if you've run the comparison scripts and you've gone through change management. Otherwise, if you're continually just trying to bring in whole profiles and repositories, there is a litany of issues that can arise.
Yeah, and most of those kind of rear their head with, like you said, the data types mismatch, or maybe in the dev environment, I've got it with an underscore at the end of the naming convention, and in the QA environment, I don't have that underscore. So now it creates a new attribute and you're duplicating work, right? You're essentially creating duplicate.
You're creating new work, yeah. So by being meticulous and going through the process, over and over, you really cut out a lot of extra cleanup work for yourself as long as you take the time to organize it.
Okay. Are there any other considerations with the migration tool and that process, things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through the export and the import, say, of the data? How does that work?
Really, the way that we've started to focus it is using it as building blocks. So with the components of a profile and the way that it builds into a repository, a migration will really need that same order of operation. So typically you'd want to run in your code sets first, then put the profile that contains those code sets secondary, repositories. And once you have the building block of your code sets to profiles to repositories, then you can start to bring in your import and your export templates, your securities, any search preferences, things like that. But really, when you dump them all in together, it doesn't do it in that specific standardized order, and it kind of all tries to migrate at the same time. That's where a lot of the issues arose years ago when me and Eric were doing this with a different client. And that's really where our process arose from, because we were trying to dump everything in at once. But we found that each time we did a migration, if we took those extra couple minutes to do one migrate in for code sets, verified, then come back in through profiles, we only had to go through the process once. It would take maybe an hour. As opposed to trying to dump a whole model in at the same time, we could spend 5-6 hours trying to figure out why one attribute is breaking one linked table. So that's one thing to remind yourself of as well. And it's in that migration document, is running in your code sets first, then your profiles, then your repositories, and then the intangibles that tie in those together.
That doesn't mean I've got to create 7 different files to migrate in, right? I can still do this through one single process. I'm just going to run that process in smaller batches. Is that kind of the thought process around it?
Correct, yeah. So once you've verified all your changes, you can migrate everything out at the same time. It's really just pulling out what we have. It's when you bring them in is when you want to, separate it. But I mean, at the same time, if your migration only has 5 or 6 profile elements, just dump them all in at the same time. But if you have a series of building blocks that you need to keep track of, that's when you'd want to do the compartmental migration.
Yeah. So it's a lot like how you would build, the initial implementation, right? We come up with a concept where we say, okay, we're going to have a profile of data. We know that there's going to be certain attributes in that profile. And then from that profile, we're going to attach it to a repository. The repository is going to have certain functions that need to be there. There might be some business rules now that I'm going to create in the profile that I'm going to apply to the repository. And so if you just kind of use that surgical approach, right, you make sure that when you bring that information over, you're bringing all the key elements across.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then obviously there's some elements that can't be migrated within the tool, right? Because they live independently. And there's some that aren't migrated because they're just repositories of data. So can you kind of touch on the concept of, I know you mentioned like the scheduled framework and some of the scheduled jobs that run. Could you kind of walk through the processes around those?
Really, the scheduled activities are a big one. So when you're going through your change management meeting after running your comparisons, if you know that there's a few scheduled activities that need to be included that are tied to your specific components, what you would need to do is manually export them out of the source environment. And once you've established your migration, you've smoke tested, then you can manually bring them back in. Scheduled activities are not something that can be migrated from environment to environment. So that's always going to be a manual process. There's other things like server properties and scripts that would need to be manually brought in, that like stored procedures, different property file names, things like that. But those all need to be contained in your comparison meetings as well. But largely, there are components that are not achievable through the migrate in and out function. They're all manual activities.
And I think the main reason behind that, David, is because a lot of those functions are going to be, one, you're going to be touching a different server, you're going to be touching different export points, import points. And, so if you just migrated the straight data over for those repositories, you essentially end up overriding some of your own data, maybe in your downstream systems and whatnot, right?
That's correct. And there is a move that we may see a little bit later on in the 10.3 release where some of the configurations are actually going to be starting to be pushed into a database instead of in a specific file. And the way that it's been architected, it's kind of backwards compatible. So if there's a configuration that's set through the database tables, it will potentially override a configuration that's set in your shared config.properties, for example. But if there isn't one set, if there's a value for it in the shared config.properties, it will pull the value from shared config on startup. So there's a way to make sure, as we're going through this and and you start to utilize that functionality, that if there are those environmentally specific attributes that you don't want to move up and down between the environments, those could be stored in the database versions of the configuration files. But then if there are specific things, whether it's a trigger, whether it's a promotion between staging and a production repository, those types of things can be left in the shared config.properties so that it will pick that up as you move that information back and forth between the environments.
And I believe that was that started with 10.1, right? Was the first example where you had the shared config built in.
Correct, and you know, it's expanding slightly each step level release.
Yeah. Excellent. So that kind of ties into what I wanted to kind of talk with Michael a little bit about, because he's had more experience with some of the elements that don't necessarily migrate in the UI tool, right? There's certain functions that you can, if it's tied to the database and it's tied to a functionality in the database, you could migrate it through the migration tool. But there are components that are related, but they're not stored in the core SQL table. They're stored in, say, like EPX functionality, or they're stored in some of those property configuration files. So Michael, can you talk a little bit about some of the non-standard things that you would maybe bring up, some of those property components and how you migrate those?
Yeah, no, thanks, Eric. So starting with EPX, the EPX application is on the server itself. So that runs on a different migration component. And it's really straightforward and it's pretty easy to use, where you open the design console of the EPX application and you can simply export the workflows that need to be migrated over. But I think as you hear in this conversation that we're having, the point of emphasis is really just making sure that you have a plan around your migration process. So if it's a new implementation, right, we can simply copy the database, the EPX database, and all of the workflows would migrate or copy over to the new environment. But let's say if you're live and a new workflow was developed, you know, you don't want to do a DB copy, so you can leverage the migration component within EPX and just migrate over that brand new workflow. Likewise, let's say if you are live and you have an update to an existing workflow. So now that there's more considerations of users who are involved, you may have records and work items that are currently in process that are being worked on within the business. So now you have to consider what is the plan and what is the strategy on what do we do next? Do we send out a notification to allow our business users the ability to work on their work items, to bring them to completion before we bring in or update the workflow? Or do we allow our users to take note of the work items that are currently in process, and then we migrate over the workflow that has been updated? So those are some of the things that definitely needs to be considered in your change management process, because you don't want to, you know, have a major impact on the business and prevent them from doing their job. So.
Excellent. And there's some interdependencies here too between, say, the core PIM attribution and data and some of these EPX workflows too. Jeff had kind of mentioned and alluded to it earlier. Like, let's say my workflow is calling an attribute that I'm storing in the PIM that I need to be able to use. How do you account for that process when you're getting ready to, say, move the EPX workflow over? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so it's a combination of what Jeff mentioned, is making sure that there is a plan involved. Is if there's new attributes that are being introduced, you want to make sure that they're part of the migration strategy from the UI side, but then also ensure that those attributes are properly defined in your workflow. So those attributes do carry over within the workflow application. But let's say if that attribute is missing from the new environment or the updated environment, then you will run into errors. So they go hand in hand. You know, you want to make sure that you understand all impacts, right, from a UI perspective, and then also from an EPX perspective as well.
So there's definitely an order of operations you want to do then, right? You want to make sure that you have the data model elements in place to support the EPX workflow, right, through that process.
Correct. You definitely want to make sure that your data model is is intact and that it can support the EPX functionality.
Okay. And then beyond EPX, because we understand that the workflow engine is an independent component, but it ties in obviously across with some of the PIM functionality. What about some of the other, like, let's take a use case, like maybe I've created a custom widget that I'm using, that I'm developing in a lower environment. How do I move that element up to the upper environments, and what's the process there? Because there's not necessarily a UI component in the sense of, a migrate tool that you would pull through for the migration tool, and it's not really tied to EPX. It's sort of an independent component that you would need to pass. What's your process around that?
Yeah, that's definitely a great point. So the experience there is going back to just documenting your steps on how you deploy that custom component, right? So there is a library within the application servers where you deploy it, but then there's also other properties files that you have to update as well for that custom component to work. So as you're building that custom component in your lower environment, so dev, and you're doing your migration to QA, you definitely want to make sure that you document the steps of how to deploy that particular custom component, right? Because it may be touching, or it may be deployed in multiple libraries or folder structures, and there are other property files that you may need to update in order for it to work. And then there's steps in regards to, stopping the server, running the deploy scripts, and then restarting the application as well. So just documenting that process is very critical. So you can definitely hand that over and reproduce that process in the upper environment.
And obviously, as we talk about moving this to say from like a QA to a prod environment, there's also the concept that you may have to bring down the environment. So what do you recommend for best practice around alerting users and preparing for that process?
Yeah. So typically we work with our customers in developing a communication plan as far as an outage period. And it varies per customer, right? Some customers like to deploy overnight. And some like to deploy over the weekend. But I think the key thing is just making sure that communication, there is a communication channel, that there is a change that's going to occur. And this is what the change is, and this is when the change is going to take place. So making sure that you have a communication channel is very critical when you are doing deployments or any type of migration. And when there is a strong communication challenge or channel established, I think the process is pretty straightforward and it goes pretty well.
Okay. And so kind of tying the whole thing together, David, when we talk about the process from end to end, one of the great things about the EnterWorks tool is the ability as a business user to make a lot of changes on the fly, right? And make new configuration changes and do that work. At what point does that kind of translate over from more of a business user component to where you need to have, say, like a DevOps team or an IT team involved with the process?
So the DevOps team or an IT team in the process, this might come in the area where you need to do some of the more customized components that you have. So say, for example, you have a custom Java class that you're using to do some validation rules that have been developed in a lower environment. As a part of bringing the system down, there are scripts that even we as SEs on our dev boxes run quite often that allow us to stop and start the services, but this is something that you really would want to make sure that your DevOps team is really working on, because they're more than likely going to be the ones that are managing the machines and not the business users. So having a clear plan of how you're going to deploy that Java class, for example, or deploy any custom HTML that you might be utilizing within the program or within the platform. All of those things will really require some coordination. Anytime you're needing to bring down services and bring up services again, will require some coordination. If you're doing something that is, as Jeff was mentioning, maybe a little bit simpler, you're going directly into the system and you have one quick change that you need to do for a business rule, or one quick attribute that you need to add. You may want to make sure that you're still employing your data governance practices around that, so everyone is aware of what's going on. But the ability to add an attribute and have it instantly available for use is something that the platform affords without needing to stop and start any services. The ability to add a brand new rule, if it's a simple rule in nature, for example, without having to stop and start any services. Those are some of the flexibility areas where a business user or an administrator within the system can do things without requiring IT or DevOps help. So there's there's kind of a balance that goes on there. Anything that's really deeper behind the covers, as I mentioned, needing to deploy specialized code, needing to deploy specialized HTML for those spot cases that you're developing and trying to implement. Definitely get your DevOps team and coordinate times where you can have those system down and system up processes run. Anything else that can be handled from a simple data governance perspective, business users and administrators can handle that on their own without a services restart and without requiring any kind of DevOps or IT assistance.
Yep. And so obviously a good data governance plan needs to be in place, right? You need to know who can make those changes, who could update that. And it kind of ties into, again, what Jeff mentioned about comparing the environments too, because let's just take the use case, right, where I'm a business user and I've added a new business rule that's a simple business rule. It just essentially requires that a field is not empty. If we look at that, Jeff, and we compare now that against the QA environment versus the prod environment, how is that going to appear when you do the comparison scripts between the two?
So when you plug them into WinMerge, and of course, as long as you run the compares right and our column widths are the same, it's going to be a direct highlight. So on the left-hand column, you would have either no attribute at all or your current attribute, and then you would get a highlight of just say we added an S to something. The S would be a bright red block, and the whole left-hand column will flag every single variance that you have there. And that's the beauty of WinMerge, is it automatically flags them for you, so you can scroll down. You don't have to go through the entire list because you could have thousands and thousands of elements, but it flags each individual one for you. So you literally just need to click next issue, and you can just create your change document from that.
So that's one of the things to keep in mind, right? Because you might have a user that's defining basic business rules and doing that work within the prod environment. They may not have applied that to the QA or dev environment because you don't require that as part of your data governance plan, because it's a simple change. It's not affecting something deeply, but you need to take that into account before you migrate components up to those environments, because obviously we don't want to overwrite the work that business user has done within that environment. So are there any other considerations like that? Any other components? We mentioned business rules. What about, David, what about like code set values and new code sets and things like that?
Right, so new code set values and even new code sets in and of themselves, there is the ability from lower environments to not use the migration tool to migrate that data out, but they can be exported in a delimited format that can easily be imported into the upper levels as well. So as you go through the process of either making changes or creating brand new values or brand new listings that you need to have, there still is the data governance component that needs to make sure that everyone knows either the changes that are being made to the existing code sets or the new code sets that will be either associated with existing attributes or new attributes, right? Because people don't want to be caught off guard. But the ability to migrate that data out from the lower environments and then import it into the higher environments is a facility that can be handled very easily through the platform as well.
Right. So again, it kind of goes back to how that particular business wants to govern how they make changes within the environment, right? I may allow a user to create a new code set. I may not in my production environment. I may allow you to create a new attribute, and maybe I won't.
Exactly. And the data governance, we have sort of been couching it around just the aspect of adding data to a profile or adding code sets or doing things like that. But another part of the data governance that is really important and necessary, I think, within the platform itself is just what you mentioned, Eric, the ability to have granular control over which groups of users or which individual users can actually affect those changes. We don't want to leave the doors to the kingdom wide open so that anybody that accesses the system can make these types of changes. So being able to set that really good, not only feature function security model in place, but potentially even attribute level or record level security in place is important as you go through this process as well.
And so a good thing to think as far as governance process along with your migration process is, is this going to affect anything in a downstream system that I'm already feeding to? Is it going to affect anything in my upstream process that I'm picking up? Is it going to affect anything in my workflow process that I'm currently running? And if the answer is no to those, then I think you've got the answer as to whether or not that user can make that change. If it could potentially affect any of those core components, that's where you kind of have to really employ the data governance process and test it from dev to QA to prod, along your chain that way, and then use these migration practices to bring those up the stack.
Correct.
Michael, is there anything else to consider around some of the additional components that are maybe stored within the server components that don't migrate through the tool that we would need to think of?
Yeah, so one of the key elements that I would say that's pretty common is, the EnterWorks properties file, right? So if there's a need to send email notifications within the tool, you would have to manually migrate that information over and update the properties file. So back to Jeff's point, when you run your comparison script, those property settings should be easily called out. So you can easily update those, the upstream or the upper environment properties file. Other common use cases are, validation levels, right? So if you're defining new validation levels per business, then that would need to be migrated and updated in the upper environments as well. So.
Okay, good. Any other thoughts from the group or around best practices for migration or anything else? Like David, do you have anything else you'd like to add to start?
I think we've covered it pretty well at this point in time. Everyone's environment is slightly different as they go through their governance and migration processes. We really highly recommend utilizing the at a minimum 3 environments: a QA and a pre-production and a production, or QA and a staging and a production, if you will. There's also the ability to do pre-staging to staging to production if necessary for your environment. So make sure that you take advantage of those facilities within the platform to ensure that you thoroughly test and that everything that you're planning on having impact your upper environments before making that final migration to your upper environment.
And one other thought just around migrating information and migrating data, there's also the concept of migrating in the patches that come from time to time. So what is your typical approach, or how do you usually approach that with our customers as far as when to deploy the patch and how to test those components in the patch, and then how to move that patch up the technology stack as well?
Right, so patches are generally cumulative for us in nature. And depending on your business needs and or the customer's business needs and what new features and functions come out within the patches, you may decide, or they may decide, not to implement a patch at a given time when it comes out. However, when you do implement the various new features within the patches, those can be implemented kind of not en masse. You can pick the features that you think you're going to need, implement those along the way, and then it becomes a matter of making sure that becomes a coordinated activity. You may be just doing a patch level release between environments. IT and DevOps are definitely required in that instance, because there may be some database scripts that need to be run. There may be some things that need to be physically installed or set up through some of the installation configuration scripts as well. So you'll need their help to do that. That's not something that the business or an administrative user can do. But the patch releases are generally well documented so that you have an idea of what the features and functions are that are going to be included within that patch. And then, as I mentioned before, you as a customer have the flexibility to decide which, if any, of the features in that patch you will implement and how you might do that. So there's a lot of flexibility within that process, and our customers take advantage of that quite liberally. We have some that upgrade every single patch every single time, and then there are some that we have to kind of gently suggest maybe you want to move up to a different patch level in order to take advantage of some of the new features that can help with problems that are going on in their environment at any given time.
And with that patching process as well, it's kind of the same concept as the migration process. You could run the patch in a lower environment, run all of your testing and configuration, maybe make sure that everything works and the new functions that you want are in there, and then eventually move that entire patch up the technology stack, right?
Correct. That is absolutely correct.
Okay, so it provides a lot of flexibility there as well. Jeff, anything else that you can think of that you want to discuss?
Top of my head, I can't think of anything. We covered a lot of bases.
Okay, Michael, any thoughts?
No, I think we covered a lot. So yeah, I think we're pretty good here.
Excellent. Did we have any questions, Tracy, that we want to go over?
I currently don't see any questions. I think that you guys covered a lot of really great information today. So if we want to give a second to see if anybody has a question, then I would be more than happy to go ahead and close and give everybody back about 15 minutes of their day.
One thing I think I would like to just add as we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions, planning. If you haven't heard it from Eric, Jeff, Michael, and myself already enough through the course of this conversation, planning really is the key. Make sure you have a great organization as far as how you want to apply any changes that you might want to make in your environment, and then be very, very meticulous and diligent about planning the movement between the different environments. Again, being meticulous with that planning, it may seem a little bit a little bit overwhelming at first, but it will save a lot of heartburn down the road as you start to go down the path.
Excellent. It looks like Vijay just asked a question about property files. Wanted to get a kind of an idea of a high level about them and how to manage them and sort of what kind of changes you would see there. So I guess what that breaks out into two separate concepts, right? We have the shared configuration properties, which are a lot of the components that, as you mentioned, David, they're actually starting to move those into the UI component, and you can actually manage them. So an example of that might be, I want to change the background color in the classic UI of the header so that I know that I'm in my dev environment. Versus my QA environment versus my prod environment. Those sorts of things you can manage directly in the UI now under the server config properties, as long as you're on, I think it's 10.1 or higher, correct, David?
That's correct. Sorry, I'm trying
10.1,
Yeah, so as long as you're on version 10.1 or higher, you can actually make those changes directly in the UI now, and then they will take effect. And then within those shared config properties, there's also additional components like Michael had mentioned, the promotions processes, right? Let's see, like the validation levels and describing what those validation levels are. Also some potential new configuration components that you might add in there. Like if you had, say, a custom widget that you deployed, there might be something in the shared properties file that needs to be updated in those. So Michael, can you kind of walk through how you update those and what you would do and how those will get moved up the stack?
Yeah, so it goes back to the point that I made earlier. So if you're making, for example, a promotion update, so now you have a promotion repository, you define that in dev. The best practice is to run your comparison script, right, between that shared properties file against the upper environment. And then you want to make sure that you locate all shared config files, right? Because the shared config touches different services within the application, right? So it's going to touch Tomcat and JBoss, and then also EPX, JBoss, EPX, Tomcat. So you want to make sure that you identify all the shared config files, and it may differ per environment. So depending on your architecture, you may just have a one server architecture in your dev environment. In QA and prod, you may have multi-level. So that means that you're going to have multiple files that you have to update. So making sure that you account for that is also critical. So.
And one of the things to kind of keep in mind with the properties files on them is that when we do the initial implementation, those are kind of auto-populated with the key core properties that you wouldn't necessarily change. Within it, there's only a few things that you'll probably be editing at any given time. The key one that comes to mind is promotions, because you might add a new repository, for example, to your repository list, and you may need to promote the data within those repositories. So that would be something that you would update within the shared config file, and then push that up your technology stack so that it would allow for promotion of those particular products. For the most part, the components in the shared config and within the properties files are already predetermined for you. So there's not a lot in there. As far as a specific list, really, I don't know if we necessarily have a specific list of those, because it's going to be by customer, right? Different customers are going to need to make those changes. But there is documentation within the config file itself. It's typically separated in a section, and then it tells you what that section configures, and then there's some detail around it in there. Is there anything else to add around that, David?
I know as we start to pull more and more of those configs into the database and exposing them through the user interface down in the system section, there's a little bit of a tabular format because it's being represented like a repository. So some of the documentation, if you will, around that, what is this particular, what type of configuration is it? Is it a shared config, or is it a workflow config type of thing? That shows up in the table, the value that you have for a particular configuration and what that configuration's description is. All of that information is in there. As we start to do that, as Michael was mentioning, in particular, things like the shared config.properties, in the current way that it's deployed through the application, there are 4 shared config properties files that you have to deal with, right? One for the JBoss and one for Tomcat and 3 for the JBosses, I guess, depending on how you set that up. As you start to move this into the database, right, it only has to really be in one location. And as the system is being brought up, it handles the ability to make sure that Tomcat and JBoss are reading it appropriately from the table structure. So you may not have to manage it 4 times. You only have to manage it 1 time. An advantage of having it in a single repository like that. So as we go through and mature this a little bit more and continue to pull more and more configurations into this, I think you'll see that it will become easier to manage, at least from a configuration standpoint. It'll be easier to manage that directly through the user interface and potentially through imports and exports than having to go to a specific file and use Notepad++ or something like that to edit it to make those changes across environments.
And then tied to that, that works with the shared config components, but typically the other configuration properties, like for example, for EPX, or if you're going to add a new Java process, custom Java process, those are going to have to be managed within the server and updating the property value to that, because essentially you're going to call a new service potentially, like maybe I'm going to call a Java class that allows me to convert an Excel to CSV or something like that, right? And I need to call that through. Those are going to have to get added to the core properties files rather than the shared config. So it's a little bit different scenario there too. And so that's not something that you're typically going to manage in the UI, because it's a little bit deeper under the covers, right? That's kind of the thought process around those, David.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So there will always be a blend of things. We'll never have every single configuration in the database table. It would just be a little bit too cumbersome, I believe. But we are, trying to streamline the process as much as possible, because we've heard a lot of feedback from customers about trying to make that a little bit easier.
Excellent. Any other questions? I don't see anything popping up yet.
There's a question in the Q&A that I'll go ahead and take on, and and the question was from Kevin. It says, do you see a migration tool to move these coming in the future? And I think we'll kind of, from the EnterWorks perspective, we're always looking at ways, as I mentioned, to create new migration policies inside of, or new migration features and functions inside of the tool to help make things easier. Along with that, some of our partners work on their own tools to help with migration scripts. And I think Amplifi has a really good migration process that they work through in order to help customers move information between the environments. So Eric, I don't know if you have additional info that you'd like to discuss, or the Amplifi team that may want to discuss about that.
Yeah, we do have a process that we use to pull that across, and I've seen other customers use similar processes too that usually align with whatever that particular organization's IT team uses. So they can use existing IT tools. There's nothing to say that you couldn't use like GitHub to grab your information or any of that, and then create sort of a golden copy of the server structure and those files, and then move those up the stack as well. And we've seen that used before. As a process to manage that as an IT process for the core configurations. What that does is that gives you the advantage to be able to manage one centralized location for those properties files and shared config files. The disadvantage of doing that is that obviously if someone goes in and changes those files and then you migrate them, you're going to migrate over their changes in the backend server. Typically, you're not going to run into that as much because it's usually going to be a developer that's working in that environment that's fairly confident and comfortable with working with those properties files, but that is something to kind of think of as you look at your migration process for some of those backend services.
All right, it sounds like we got every question that anybody could ask about migration kind of covered. If you do have additional questions, you can feel free to send us an email at experts@goamplify.com. We do have the ability for you to have one-on-one time with our Ask the Expert experts. I appreciate everyone for attending today's webinar. You will get a follow-up email in the coming days that will include the recording, a direct link to it. But if you're ever curious about any of the Ask the Experts that we've had or any resources that we have at Amplifi, you can go to our website at goamplify.com. Keep your eyes peeled for upcoming sessions. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.